Well, today's the day. If you remember the end of my last review, I got a request to do a game called The Legend of Alon.
Being that it was the first request I've gotten since first starting this little charade, I naturally did some research and found that it's considered to be one of the worst RPGs ever made. I'll state for a fact that I'm a huge fan of RPGs, with many games in the genre being among my favorites. And to be honest, I don't think I've ever played a bad RPG before. Sure, I've played a few that were considered disappointing, but never one I could consider bad.
Which makes me both afraid and curious to play through an RPG that's considered by some to be the worst ever. So, I went on Amazon, paid about $2, and 1 week later, here it is. The Legend of Alon for the PlayStation 2.
To start off, let's look at the cover art. If you were to find this game on a shelf, would this look like an interesting game to you? A guy showing off what looks like a tattoo on his hand? Yay, very gripping. I wouldn't have so much of a problem with this if it didn't look so lifeless. Where's all the color that many other RPGs of the time period had in their box art? Another thing to note is that this game is printed on a blue disc. This was common on many PS2 games released between 2000 and 2002, and unfortunately, quite a few problems came with them. Newer models of the PS2, including mine, can sometimes run into trouble getting them to work. Thankfully, I've only had problems running 2 games, and all my other Blue Disc games run very good, save for this innocent little grinding noise. But then Alon had to set its own example. Makes me think the system's gonna catch fire!
But anyway, I think I've stalled long enough, so let's just play the game.
The game opens up with what I can assume is our main character dreaming about what I can assume is a demon from hell. The demon does evil stuff for about a minute before our hero wakes up.
And I sure as hell can't figure out what that was about.
So the FMV ends, and we're introduced to the in-game graphics. To say the least, they're not that good. The character models look quite blocky and cartoonish, and many of the buildings, geographies, and textures are pretty simplistic looking. And before you go defending the game, saying the PS2 was barely a year old, so it should be expected the developers didn't use the full potential of the PS2's hardware, take note that this game came out a few months after Final Fantasy X, which was arguably one of the best looking games of that year. Meanwhile, we have this game, which looks like through a slight downgrade, it could have easily been released as a game on the original PlayStation.
You know what? Now that I think about it, these blue discs are actually printed on CDs rather than the DVDs that the PS2 was famous for supporting. And PS1 games were printed on CDs. So, what would happen if I put this in a PS1?
I'd better put it back now. Getting back to the game's opening, we're treated to a 7-minute long cutscene, during which nothing of substance happens. Our main character, whose name is Jarek by the way, gets laughed at for being a pathetic youth. He talks with a girl who's apparently another pathetic youth. The village gets attacked by creatures that we've never heard about before, and by attack, I mean they burn one building and attack a couple of people. I mean, just see how long the attack lasts.
Stop! What are you doing here? Why do you attack us? By the weird.
Yeah, how tragic. This still makes the big bad soldiers angry, and they leave to attack the place where the creatures came from, while some old lady tells Jarek some mystical bullshit about a symbol that was burned into his hand, and oh my god, can this story get any more generic?
Alright, just settle down for a minute. So the game's overall presentation so far isn't that good. But who knows? Just because the game's graphics and story are lacking doesn't mean the game won't be fun to play. Alright, let's go.
Finally, the scene ends, and you can take control of Jarek. Unfortunately, the game forces you through painfully slow tutorials in order to learn about things such as how to equip items and fight enemies. When you finally get the chance to get out of the village, you'll find that there's actually quite a few side quests to do. Unfortunately, most of them amount to either being simple fetch quests that involve you searching for collections of items around the map, or killing a certain group of enemies. Such as this one, where you have to kill 3 of these dinosaur-looking things in a cave.
Well, these are the first enemies in the game that we get to fight, so they can't be too much of a problem, right? I had to ask.
What is up with the attack speed on these things? It feels like they can get in almost a dozen hits before you're even allowed to strike back. And given that they usually do 3 points of damage per hit, you can barely survive an encounter with one of them, let alone 3! Okay, the bastard knocked half my health out, so I better go to the menu to use healing items. What? Why can't I use the health potion? You mean to tell me I can only use items in battle? What good will that do me? Seeing that these things will probably chip away all the health the potions can recover me, how the hell am I gonna survive fighting them? Wait, what is this? Why can't I move? What's that Wait a minute. So you can use healing items on the field? How in the hell was I supposed to know that? I know you might be thinking, gee, didn't you just go through a bunch of tutorials? Well, yes I did, and I swear to God, they only taught you how the battle system in the menu works. Shame on me for following my natural instincts and going to the menu to use items. I should have known that you needed to use items through an inventory screen you bring up with the circle button. Even then, it's still not going to make these fights easier. I need a better weapon. Let's see what the shop has to offer. That axe looks pretty strong, but I'm a few coins short. Maybe selling some of the healing plants you find on the ground could help me raise the money. And selling it was clearly a dumbass move, since it was apparently worth 0 coins. That's kind of harsh. You don't get a single coin for selling a healing herb that can be quite valuable to you this early in the game? Sure, they can be found in quite a few places, but that doesn't mean they should sell for nothing. The useless junk you found lying around the Fallout games have more value than these plants. So, in order to get the money I need for the axe, I need to fight more of these fucking enemies, and just hope there's enough plants left to keep me healed. Finally. Now they should be no problem. You son of a bitch! It does the exact same amount of damage as the dagger you start out with! In fact, I think it may be a little weaker! Not to mention, your time bar fills a lot slower when using it, so what the hell am I supposed to do now? The game does tell you that different weapons work better on different enemies, but at this point in the game, you can only get daggers, axes, and hammers that can just barely kill them after some trial and error, and staffs that do absolutely nothing! Well, I tried again and again, and I found that it was impossible to complete the cave side quest with my current stats. So fuck the cave, let's just continue down the main story path. Oh, well there's a fucking surprise. The path is guarded by 2 of them. Of course, I try to fight through them, but I just die and die and die. It was only when I backtracked and collected every last plant I could find to heal myself as much as I could that I finally took them down. Now I can finally go to the next part of the game. And now I'm fighting zombies that randomly come out of the ground. Watch as I die in one hit or something. Are you kidding me? A zombie who attacks me with a sword goes down with no problems, yet a bunch of dippy little things are my worst nightmare? In fact, now that I think about it, even they're going down a lot easier now, because I've reached a shop that sells swords, which happens to be the weapon they're weak against. Alright, I'm sorry, I need to ask this question. What kind of logic were the developers following when designing this combat system? I'll admit, making different weapons work better on different enemies is not a bad idea, but this game seems to think that's perfectly okay to make every other weapon that an enemy is not weak against useless. Look at the amount of damage the dagger is supposed to do and compare it to the strength of the axe. That's a pretty big difference in damage, but the little turd things are not weak to the dagger and axe, so throw all those stats out the window and just make them do 3 points of damage. This system has been handled much better in games like the Persona series. Those games had a very similar weakness system in that certain enemies were either weak, resistant, or immune to certain types of weapons. But if the enemies had no weakness or immunity to a certain weapon, then the overall strength of the weapon would not be affected. A fact that Alon clearly does not follow. But anyway, seeing that the game suddenly decided to go from being too damn hard to too damn easy, I decided to grind a little bit to prevent further trouble. But thanks to the fact that enemies do not respawn, I was only able to level up to level 1 from level 0? Yeah, I bet they thought they were being funny by thinking that up. I also now have access to what the game calls the safe zone, which replenishes your health, lets you buy extra skills for your weapons, and can teleport you to different locations. Of course, this doesn't change the fact that the side quests and the exploration of the in-game world aren't interesting in the slightest, and the story and characters have yet to convey any value.
But now that I've reached a point where the combat is tolerable, let's press on, see if it gets better.
So through the safe zone, the only place we can teleport is to the place the game wants us to go. A swamp. Here, the enemies we encounter are lizard-like things that...
You're joking, right? Game, is this gonna be your thing? Just throw a set of enemies that will kick my ass to no end, and by the time I finally get the resources I need to beat them, you'll just throw another set of enemies in their place, and they will kick my ass to no end! And you know what? That's exactly what this game's combat is! A process of trial and error. Something that's incredibly easy to do wrong! And you know what? I know what you may be thinking. Just because it's hard doesn't mean it's bad, but you know what? It's hard for the wrong reasons!
I've played quite a few RPGs that are hard and require some trial and error, with games like Persona 2 Eternal Punishment coming to mind. But in those games, there was a learning curve to them, and eventually, you learned exactly what you needed to do in order to make the game easier. Sure, you may die a lot, but that's because you weren't good enough and simply needed to get better. In Alon, on the other hand, there's pretty much no way you can get better at this point in the game, seeing that most of the enemies you encounter are a hell of a lot stronger than you are, and thanks to your often slow-ass time bar, you're practically helpless against them. So there's pretty much nothing you can do but die over and over again and trying to figure out how to deal with them. It doesn't help that the game sometimes forcefully handicaps you by not allowing you access to the weapons enemies could be weak against. All the more reason why the combat should not have focused so much on this fucking weakness system! Couple all of this with repetitive side quests and a bland and uninteresting story, then you have yourself one of the worst excuses for an RPG ever created!
But but I'm not going to let the game beat me. Why? Because it actually has a fan base.
Yeah, I'm not even joking. The game has a fan base that will probably give Land of the Dead Road to Fiddler's Green a run for its money. But with Land of the Dead, it's easy for me to understand why the game has its fan base. For one thing, the game's problems mostly stem from its instability rather than its gameplay, and the game has a PC fan base that's created mods to help fix the game's problems. With Alon, I don't get it. At all. Most people seem to praise the fact that depending on the weapons you use and the skills you build up, you can create characters in any way you like. Well, guess what? This was nothing new, as many RPGs before Alon had a system similar to this, and many of them executed it in a much better way. I've even seen a few of them praise the weakness system in the slow time bar, claiming that it adds realism that many RPGs ignore. Interesting. I didn't know people would get so tired from swinging an axe once that they needed to take a 10-second breath before they could swing it again. I also didn't know that little rodent-like things could take so much abuse from sharp, pointy axes, yet dimpy little swords are their worst nightmare. Additionally, one thing that baffles me is that everyone who loves this game always brings up a two-player option. Yeah, once you get your second party member, a second player can actually jump in and play. People who praise this game go on and on saying how much fun the two-player mode is, but my question is, what does it really amount to? The only real advantage you get is being able to make slightly faster decisions in combat, which won't help you anyway if the enemies are relentlessly beating you to death.
But you know what? A lot of people that do like this game admit that it does take a while for it to pick up, so that's why I want to press on for at least a little bit more, to see if it does.
So after backtracking and completing the cave side quest, I receive a stone orb that allows me to cast earth magic. The game's definition of earth magic happens to be freezing enemies in place, so this could help in fighting the enemies in the swamp. The only downside is that they're not weak to earth spells, and since they're always fought in pairs, a single battle with them will drain almost 75% of your magic points. And unfortunately, you can't stock up a magic replenishing item since they're not sold in shops. So every time I fight a group of enemies, I have to backtrack all the way to the safe zone to replenish my magic. Yeah, this is the messiah of RPGs, alright. Eventually, you reach the town you were trying to warn. Only to find it burnt to the ground by the soldiers.
Quite frankly, I almost forgot what we were fighting for at this point, so why should I care?
It's here where we meet our second party member, a guy that looks like Cthulhu and acts like an I don't like you, but I must work with you stereotype.
Stop! I am not your enemy!
Mahir, my brother. For your sake, I will let this Oran dog live, though I would rather tear out his heart.
But anyway, now that we have a helping hand, the battles with the lizards should be easier now. Right?
Clearly, they adjusted themselves accordingly.
Good God, this guy is useless! His stats dwarf that of our own, yet because the lizards aren't weak to his default axe, he doesn't do much damage. And his time bar is pathetically slow when using it. Just look at how long it lasts. Look at how long it lasts! What kind of muscle man sits with his thumb up his ass for that long just because he swung an axe? I then went to his equipment menu and equipped him with a dagger in his inventory, which happens to be the weapon the lizards are weak against, and his time bar now moves a little faster too, so now I have a perfect setup for the lizards. They seem to be the only enemies I'm encountering in the swamp, so there should be no problems, right?
I give up. I know it's kind of abrupt, but clearly this is the game's style. Throw set after set of enemies that are incredibly hard to kill and force me to go through trial and error and try to figure out how to beat them! But you know what? Maybe that's why the game has its fan base.
I'm being serious when I say that. The fact that this game forces you to adjust differently to every scenario presented to you through trial and error can provide a sense of realism, which is probably why a lot of people look at this game in a more positive light. Is this a type of game I would enjoy? No. I still feel that all forms of realism are thrown out the window with the combat and its weakness system, the in-game exploration and side quests are incredibly bland and repetitive, and the story lacks originality. To me, this probably is the worst RPG I've played to date, and it's one that I don't recommend if you're a fan of traditional RPGs. But if you're willing to try a flawed yet different take on the genre, I suppose you could try the game out and see if you fall in the crowd that likes this game.
But I stand with the crowd who hates it. And because this was the first RPG I outright hated, I think I need to play a good one, just to remember I love the genre in the first place. But before I do, thank you for the request. At least I know there's people out there that'll laugh at my pain. Thank you and good night.